Welcome to Tell Me More Stories Told This podcast. We are diving deep today into a story that's captivating and heartbreaking, the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
A conflict that on the surface, seems straightforward, like a clash between Protestants and Catholics. But like you said, it's so much more than that.
Yeah, you scratch that surface,
Yeah.
and you just find this web of politics and history and social inequalities. It's just so tangled. Where do you even begin with a story like this?
Well, we have to go back to the beginning.
Okay.
The division of Ireland in 1922, that's where the fault lines, really began to appear, with Northern Ireland being created.
So two Irelands, each with a different vision for the future.
Exactly. You had the Unionists,
Right.
or Loyalists, mainly Protestant, who wanted to remain part of the UK. And then you have the Irish Nationalists, or Republicans, largely Catholic, who dreamt of a united Ireland free from British rule.
Okay, so two very different paths. And in this division, it went beyond just political aspirations, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
Catholics in Northern Ireland faced a lot of discrimination.
Yeah.
In areas like housing and employment. This sense of injustice really fueled resentment.
Yeah.
And that was a key factor in the rise of the civil rights movement in the 1960s.
So it's this really complex mix of history, politics, and social tension that really created like the perfect storm for conflict.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that storm, you could say, it really began to brew in the late 1960s with the emergence of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, URA. They were fighting for basic equality for all citizens.
Their campaign, it really resonated with people. There was that housing protest in Caledon in 1968 where a single Protestant woman was given a house ahead of two Catholic families that desperately needed it. That must have been infuriating.
It was a very stark example of the discrimination that was happening, and it sparked outrage. This kind of blatant injustice really galvanized the civil rights movement and fueled even greater calls for change.
But change rarely comes easily.
Yep.
And the civil rights marches, they were met with resistance, weren't they?
Yes, sadly they were. Loyalist counter-protesters clashed with civil rights marchers and even the police. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, or RUC, often seemed to side with the Loyalists.
It's like adding fuel to the fire. It feels like everything was building to a breaking point.
And it did break, quite dramatically in Derry on October 5th, 1968.
Okay.
A peaceful civil rights march was brutally attacked by the police. The event was captured on film.
Wow.
And broadcast around the world.
Wow.
And this really shocked many and became a turning point in the conflict.
It's hard to believe such a brutal response could happen to peaceful protesters.
It was a catalyst for sure. Within a year, riots erupted in Derry and Belfast in August of 1969. This led to the deployment of British troops.
Okay.
This marked the beginning of Operation Banner, the British Army's longest continuous deployment, lasting for decades.
Wow, that really underscores just how serious the situation became. It's around this time that those stark peace walls started being built to separate communities.
These physical barriers became a symbol of the growing divide in Northern Ireland. Imagine entire communities being physically separated by concrete walls just to try and maintain some semblance of peace.
It's a pretty sobering thought.
It is, and with tensions escalating, paramilitary groups emerged on both sides.
Right.
On the Republican side, there was the Provisional Irish Republican Army.
The IRA.
The IRA, and the official IRA. And on the Loyalist side, you had the Ulster Volunteer Force, UVF,
Okay.
and the Ulster Defense Association, UDA.
Wait, two IRAs? That sounds confusing.
It was. The IRA had split in 1969,
Okay.
with the Provisional IRA, or the Provos, believing that armed struggle was the only way to achieve a united Ireland. The official IRA favored a more political approach.
So armed groups on both sides with different goals and this like rising tide of fear and suspicion, it's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
And tragically, disaster did strike just a few years later on a day that became known as Bloody Sunday.
Bloody Sunday.
Yeah.
And before we went to that break, we were just talking about the emergence of those paramilitary groups on both sides of this conflict.
Yeah.
It felt like things were just, inevitably heading towards violence.
They were. On January 30th, 1972, British paratroopers opened fire on unarmed civil rights protesters in Derry,
Right.
killing 13 people. That day would forever be known as Bloody Sunday.
Bloody Sunday. It's hard to imagine, a more horrific event, and the impact that it had on the conflict must have been profound.
Oh, it was a turning point. Many Catholics who had initially seen the British Army as, a peacekeeping force, now saw them as the enemy.
Right.
It fueled so much anger and resentment, and support for the IRA grew exponentially.
Yeah, so instead of, bringing peace, the Army's actions tragically seemed to just escalate the violence even further. Were there any attempts to kind of like de-escalate the situation at that point?
Well, there were attempts, but often they seem to just backfire. Take, for example, the introduction of internment without trial in 1971. This was a policy aimed at curbing IRA activity, but it ended up alienating the Catholic community even further.
Internment without trial. That sounds incredibly unjust. How did that even work in practice?
Essentially, it allowed authorities to imprison people suspected of, being involved with paramilitary groups without any legal process, without charges and without a trial.
So people were just taken from their homes and imprisoned indefinitely without any proof.
That's right. And many of those detained weren't even involved in paramilitary activity at all.
Wow.
It was a very blunt instrument, and it really created this deep sense of injustice within the nationalist community. It actually drove more people towards the IRA, who were seen as the only ones standing up for their rights.
It's almost as if, the policies that were intended to, bring peace just had the opposite effect.
Yeah.
And just driving those two sides further apart.
Exactly. And tragically, Bloody Sunday wasn't the only instance of violence against civilians. The Ballymurphy massacre,
Right.
just a few months prior, saw 10 innocent civilians killed by the British Army as well.
It's hard to fathom the scale of injustice and the suffering that people endured. And it didn't end there, did it? The troubles went on for decades.
For 3 long decades, violence plagued Northern Ireland, claiming over 3,500 lives. Civilians caught in the crossfire made up the majority of the casualties.
4,500 lives, it's just a staggering number. And countless others, were injured or just left with this lasting trauma.
The troubles weren't just, isolated incidents of violence. They became kind of woven into the fabric of everyday life. Think constant security checkpoints, bomb scares becoming almost routine,
Right.
sectarian violence always lurking just around the corner. People lived with this level of tension and fear that's difficult to comprehend.
It's like living under a constant state of siege. Were there any moments of hope during this period? Any glimpses of light in the darkness?
There were moments, yes, but often tinged with tragedy. The 1981 hunger strikes, for example,
Right.
brought the plight of Republican prisoners to international attention. 10 prisoners died, sacrificing their lives for their beliefs.
It's a powerful testament to their convictions, but also just a heartbreaking reminder of the human cost of this conflict.
Exactly. And through it all, the violence persisted, ebbing and flowing, but never truly disappearing. The conflict just seemed intractable. With shifting alliances, external funding sources, this complex web of political maneuvering, all adding to the chaos. It felt like Northern Ireland was trapped in the cycle of violence with no way out.
But even in the darkest of times, there's always that, flicker of hope.
Right.
And in the 1990s, things began to shift. Didn't both Loyalist and Republican paramilitary groups declare ceasefires?
They did, and it felt like a real turning point, those ceasefires.
Yeah.
Although fragile, offered a glimmer of hope. They created the space for dialogue and negotiation, eventually paving the way for the Good Friday Agreement of 1998.
The Good Friday Agreement, a landmark achievement. But what exactly did it entail? Was it enough to finally bring an end to the violence?
Well, the Good Friday Agreement was a complex document, but at its heart was the principle of power sharing. Unionists and nationalists would govern together,
Okay.
sharing responsibility and working towards a shared future. A new police force, the PSNI, was established with cross-community representation
Right.
to ensure fair policing. And importantly, paramilitary groups committed to decommissioning their weapons.
Decommissioning. What exactly does that involve? How do you ensure that, armed groups are truly relinquishing their weapons?
Decommissioning was a crucial part of the peace process. It involved paramilitary groups putting their weapons beyond use,
Okay.
typically under the supervision of independent observers. It was a complex and often fraught process, requiring a great deal of trust on all sides.
Trust, that must have been, the hardest thing to rebuild after decades of conflict. But it was a necessary step to move forward.
Absolutely. The Good Friday Agreement was a monumental achievement, but it didn't erase the past overnight. The journey towards peace was just beginning.
So we have this landmark agreement, a framework for peace. But what about the human cost of the conflict? The victims, the families that were torn apart, the generation marked by trauma. Where do they fit into this new era of peace?
That's an incredibly important question, and one that we'll explore in more depth after a quick break. We'll be right back to delve into the legacy of the Troubles and the ongoing challenges of building a lasting peace.
So before the break, we were discussing the Good Friday Agreement. And it was a monumental achievement. But peace isn't just about signing agreements. It's also about, healing the wounds of the past and rebuilding trust after decades of conflict.
You're absolutely right. The Good Friday Agreement provided a framework for peace, but the real work, the human work, was just beginning. Thousands of people had lost loved ones. Many carried physical and emotional scars from the violence.
Right.
Entire communities were fractured, and the social fabric of Northern Ireland was deeply torn.
It's hard to even imagine how you begin to address that level of trauma.
Yeah.
Where do you even start?
Well, it starts with acknowledgement. It starts by creating spaces for people to tell their stories, to be heard, and to have their experiences validated.
Right.
For many, simply having their suffering acknowledged was a huge step toward healing.
So listening becomes crucial, not just to victims of violence, but, to all sides of the story.
Precisely. Truth and reconciliation are essential pillars in building a lasting peace.
Right.
This involves investigating past atrocities, holding perpetrators accountable, and providing support for victims and survivors. It also requires an honest and open dialogue about the past, however painful that may be.
But that kind of dialogue, that can be incredibly difficult, especially when emotions are still so raw. How do you foster that kind of openness and understanding after so much hurt and anger?
It's a long and challenging process.
Yeah.
It requires empathy, patience, and a willingness to listen to perspectives that you might not agree with.
Right.
It also requires strong leadership and a commitment to justice and equality from all sides.
So it's not just about moving on. It's about actively working towards reconciliation.
Exactly. And that work involves addressing the root causes of the conflict, the very things that fueled the Troubles in the first place. Discrimination, inequality, lack of opportunity. These issues needed to be tackled head-on to prevent future conflict.
It's about building a society where everyone feels valued and respected and has a chance to thrive regardless of their background. Is that truly possible after such a deeply divisive conflict?
It is possible, but it requires ongoing effort and commitment from everyone involved. The Good Friday Agreement provided the blueprint, but it's up to each generation to continue the work of building a truly shared future for Northern Ireland.
So the journey toward peace is far from over. It's an ongoing process, and one that requires constant vigilance and dedication. What are some of the specific challenges that still remain today?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is dealing with the legacy of the past. There are still unanswered questions about past atrocities, and many victims and families feel that justice has not been served. Addressing these issues is crucial for building trust and fostering genuine reconciliation.
So accountability remains a key issue.
Yes, and so it is building trust between communities. The peace walls that were erected during the Troubles, they still stand in some areas.
Right.
A stark reminder of the divisions that persist. Bridging those divides and creating opportunities for people to interact and build relationships, this is essential for creating a more cohesive society.
It's like those walls. They become a physical manifestation of the psychological barriers that still exist.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And those barriers can be difficult to overcome, but it's not impossible. There are many organizations and individuals working tirelessly to build bridges between communities, to promote understanding and foster reconciliation. Their work is vital for creating a more peaceful and just future for Northern Ireland.
That's encouraging to hear. So despite the challenges, there is hope for a brighter future.
Absolutely. The Troubles were a dark chapter in Northern Ireland's history.
Yeah.
But they also demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit and the power of dialogue and reconciliation. The Good Friday Agreement was a remarkable achievement.
Right.
And it shows what's possible when people come together with a shared commitment to peace.
It's a reminder that even the most intractable conflicts can be resolved through dialogue and compromise and a willingness to build a shared future. The Troubles are a testament to both the human capacity for conflict and our potential for peace. It's a story that everyone should know, a story of loss and suffering, but also a story of hope and resilience and the enduring power of the human spirit.
Well said. And it's a story that continues to unfold. The future of Northern Ireland depends on the choices that each generation makes. Choices that will determine whether they embrace the lessons of the past or repeat the mistakes that led to so much pain and suffering.
It's a future that is yet to be written. A future where peace is not just an aspiration, but a living reality. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Troubles. We hope it's inspired you to learn more about this complex and compelling chapter of history, and to consider the role we all play in building a more peaceful and just world. And don't forget to subscribe to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast so you don't miss our next deep dive into another captivating story.